This is something that genuinely I think you need to know about if you're going to start a business in the next year. Hello, and welcome back to my channel. So my name is Catherine and I am the founder of Anja Health. We basically help pregnant parents freeze stem cells from their umbilical cords and placenta to use for future disease treatment. And I was in Y Combinator's W22 batch as a solo female founder that is relatively non-technical. So I'm here to impart my wisdom today. So today I'm going to be talking about everything that I learned in the 3 months of doing the Y Combinator batch for any folks that maybe applied and didn't get in or are curious about what you can learn in Y Combinator and if it's worth it to try and apply and get in. So I'm going to summarize everything that I learned in 10 minutes. There's definitely so many more lessons within the Y Combinator program. And I think the biggest benefit of being a part of Y Combinator is the network and access to Bookface, which is the internal YC community. There's so many investor, other founder resources, other educational videos that you have access to as a YC founder that can really help with your founder journey. So overall, I would still say that you should apply to YC, even if you're watching videos like this one and trying to learn all of the lessons without giving up equity. But personally, I think giving up the equity was worth it, especially because I'm a solo founder and I seek a lot of community and mentorship in external areas. So for my YC experience, we were actually one of the very last remote batches due to COVID, but I actually did end up moving to San Francisco for YC because I wanted to be in the thick of it. So I moved into a hacker house with 3 other YC founders from prior batches. And this was really helpful for me because I was able to bounce ideas off of the people that I was living with. And since they had already completed YC, I was able to really get a good sense of the lessons that you learn even when it is in person. Plus, I would go to the happy hours that were self-organized by other YC founders during this time so that we could talk about the lessons that we learned. And I think that the greatest lesson that I learned during YC is to launch really quickly and overall just gear towards having momentum, and anything else is fluff. And I feel like I made a lot of unnecessary expenditures that geared towards this fluff concept. And now rereading these YC notes, I think I should have really listened to YC more. So there are basically talks twice a week during the batch at least, plus you have office hours with partners. And so a lot of these recommendations I'm about to give you are basically things that I wrote in my YC notes from the talks that they gave, plus the office hours that I had. At a certain point, I'm going to be honest, I stopped watching all of the talks as intently because I started fundraising pretty early on into the batch, which I'll talk about. But I still think you can get the general gist of what you learn from YC and also what I wish I knew sooner. Without further ado, here are the various lessons that I learned in 3 months of doing Y Combinator. The curriculum pretty much stays the same. They evolve the curriculum, especially as it relates to certain marketing channels so that they can update it to modern times. I'm sure now AI is a more critical part of the Y Combinator curriculum, but overall the principles have stayed the same since it was founded by Paul Graham in the early 2000s. So the first bit of advice that you will learn in Y Combinator is you need to make something that people want. Brian Chesky famously gives one of the very first talks in Y Combinator. He was one of the co-founders and today CEO of Airbnb. And he really emphasizes this during his talk. You want to try and find fans for your product so that you know that you are making something that people want. The second biggest lesson that I learned in Y Combinator was how to launch properly, and especially how you can leverage Y Combinator's network to launch properly. So first of all, they suggest launching on Hacker News. If you don't already know, Hacker News is basically like a Reddit for indie hackers and kind of folks that they were gearing towards to be in YC. And in general, I find that Hacker News is a very critical environment. So it's a good way to initially test the idea that you have and get a sense of all of the criticisms that you could potentially receive. And also reading Hacker News is a good way to stay up to date with what's happening innovation-wise. So they suggest launching there as an option. You can also launch on Product Hunt, which is especially good for software products. And then you can also do a Bookface launch where you launch internally to YC. And this is especially beneficial if you're doing a B2B product because you can automatically launch to all of the YC companies. There's so many YC founders who are currently active and non-active that view Bookface every single day. A lot of my YC founder, especially guy friends, view Bookface more than they view any other social media platform, or they don't have social media at all and they only look at Bookface. So if you're launching a B2B product, this is a really good way to gain a lot of visibility quickly. And then they also recommend the typical press release option as a launch, but press is not really a scalable option. So you can do the TechCrunch route and things like that. And I personally did that. We hired a PR agency, but I think that that was a waste of venture dollars because it's $12K a month, which is insane. So I genuinely wish that I just did my own outbound to reporters and I did not actually end up doing, I wish I did a lot of outbound to reporters rather than hiring a PR agency. So I personally wish that I knew this sooner, so you should too. Next, YC talks about how to build on metrics and what metrics to track. They emphasize making sure that you are tracking a lot of metrics a lot, which you should definitely take very seriously. They suggest things like post hog, mix panel, etc. And you want to basically determine what are all of the points of conversion for a customer and all the potential points of drop off, and what are the triggers that get customers to move past each drop off point. However, another big YC principle is talk to users as often as possible. So especially for your first, let's say 100 or so users, personally, I agree with this YC advice that you should be onboarding each customer and also continuing the conversation after you onboard them, because A, it provides a really good customer experience for the customer, so you're optimizing for the best outcome, but B, you can learn a lot by observing how people interact with the product. So for instance, I actually recently listened to Jessica Livingston, who is one of the co-founders of YC. She has a podcast called The Social Radar that she does with Carolyn Levy, who used to be an attorney with YC, and they interviewed the founders of Gusto, which is a payroll platform. And the Gusto founders talk about how in the beginning, they genuinely thought that founders were the best people to onboard their employees, that they should go through with them all of their mailing information and income information and things of that nature. But when they actually talked to users consistently and observed how they onboarded in real time and onboarded with them, they found that there was a lot of uncomfortability with the founder personally sitting with the employee and inputting all of their information, because there was a sense of a lack of privacy and also a waste of time on both parties. So that's what ultimately led Gusto to actually allow the employee to onboard themselves by emailing them a link to onboard onto Gusto with all their personal information. And that was a huge unlock for the Gusto founder. So that's just one of many examples as to why it is so important to continuously talk to users and onboard them personally. Because let's say maybe 1 in 10 founders actually felt that uncomfortability really strongly, and the others were okay with it but maybe didn't voice it. So that's why it's important to have a high volume of user interactions. So YC also recommends growing at least 10% per week, especially in the beginning if you can, and trying to aim for that. So when you're thinking about your growth ideas and things of that nature, you want to be optimizing for that. Next, YC talks about product development. The Justin.tv/Twitch founders typically are the ones that lead this. Justin Kahn is famously one of the co-founders, but so is Michael Seibel, who's one of the YC partners. And essentially what they emphasize is, number one, you want to define a development cycle. So for instance, that you want to set a given amount of time that you're going to be developing new features and deciding which features to develop next. So 2 weeks was recommended from the notes that I read. At the beginning of these product development cycles, you want to define what metric you want to improve, which should be basically something that contributes to revenue. And then you want to write specs on how you're going to improve that feature. And you basically want to aim for anything that moves recurring revenue, especially not just revenue, and or might improve your LTV to CAC ratio. And basically you can think about doing that through the lens of working backwards from the following framework. So if you do blank demos to get 1 customer, then if you do 20 demos, how do you set that up properly? Will that necessarily yield 20 customers? And you want to work backwards from your goals. So what actions do you need to do in order to ultimately get the maximum amount of customers, and how can you continue to scale those efforts? And you want to try and go after the easiest customers first. So for instance, with my company, Anja Health, we were targeting 3rd trimester pregnant parents, and I was finding that it was easiest to acquire them through organic content on social media. But another channel that we ended up using later was going through OBGYNs and doula referrals. But it takes a while to build out those relationships, and you only have 3 months during YC to really start acquiring customers and gain traction. So we did not look at field sales as a channel to visit those OBGYNs, and I only focused on social media and how to double down on what was working content-wise. So I was basically making content all day throughout the batch because that's what worked for me. Next, YC gave a talk on design, and basically the entire lesson in this was to design with true intent, because if you spend too long making a fluffy design, then it could end up being a waste of time. And so I ended up using a YC company called Asamic.io in order to make sure that I was designing intentionally, because it was a pretty cost-effective option and it still looked relatively nice. Plus they have a very quick turnaround. So I think that this could be a good option if you are looking into designers, or I would also look at Fiverr and Upwork to just get things done quickly. I think I initially had the assumption that really good branding could get companies really far, because you see companies like Crumble Cookies and a lot of fashion companies like Rode and Skims that basically sell a commodity, but they just slap good branding on it and maybe a celebrity face, and that's that's how they grow. So it's easy to think, oh, if I have really good branding and spend a lot of time on really good design, then my company will grow. But that's not necessarily true. And in fact, the very best companies started with really bad design, but they had a really good product, and you want to really gear towards product-led growth and not rely on virality, which I think was a mistake that I made early on. I was early on considering a design agency for $200,000, which is insane in retrospect. So I'm glad that I did not choose that. But that's a common trap that a lot of early founders fall into. Then YC gave a lot of talks on user research because one of the core YC values is to talk to users often. So they have a lot of information on this. But you should basically read the book, The Mom Test, which is frequently recommended amongst Silicon Valley folks. And it basically gives you a good guide on how to run a proper user test and user interviews in order to avoid bias. So for instance, some good questions to ask are, what have you tried to solve the problem? What's the hardest part about blank? Tell me about the last time you solved that problem. And also YC emphasizes the 3 stages of user interviews. Number 1 is basically where you're just in ideation phase and you are not pitching anything, but you're just poking around for what pain points exist. The second phase is where you are qualifying users. So you're basically asking questions to determine if they are within your target market / ICP. And then you basically try to get them to commit to buy towards the end of the call. And then the third phase is where you're basically seeking if your already in market product has product market fit, which basically happens by asking them, what would you do if the product went away today? And that's notoriously a really good sign of PMF if people desperately miss the presence of your product. Another good lesson with user testing, I think, is if you feel like you're hearing the same thing over and over again, I would say for more than 3 interviews, and you feel like you're not gaining new insights, then it's probably time to either move on to the next phase or start interviewing a different type of consumer, because it's safe to say that you have reached a certain threshold of learning. Then there are quite a few YC lessons that are specific to certain growth channels that are really popular, like SEO, paid growth, etc. But I won't go through those lessons that I had because a lot of them are things that you can find on YouTube videos, and a lot of YC lectures actually just recommended that you watch a YouTube video if you needed more insights. So that's something that you can find on YouTube. And I actually have other videos on my personal channel about how to do things like paid growth, etc. Then YC has a lesson on hiring, and they basically recommend that you do not hire during the batch because it can serve as a distraction and you only have that finite amount of time of 3 months in order to really get your product off the ground. However, they do give some initial guidelines to hiring. You want to allocate around 10% of your equity pool to new hires, to your early hires, and especially engineers, especially if you're doing a really technical product. They also recommend hiring within your network, and Paul Graham famously has a lot of insights around inserting yourself into good communities early on, and especially early stage startups, so that you can start to meet potential co-founders in the future. And lastly, they emphasize doing paid trials with people before you hire them full time, which I wish I did more of. And I also wish that I gave a more consistent feedback loop. I think because I was so young, I was 22 when I started my company, and I only really had summer internships as work experience under my belt and a couple months of a full-time job after college. I didn't really know how to be a good manager, and I felt bad giving negative feedback, and I also didn't have a consistent place to give feedback. So now what I do is have quarterly check-ins with teammates where they give me feedback, I give them feedback, and if I want to give them feedback in between those quarterly check-ins, I preface the conversation by saying, is now a good time to give you some feedback about your process? And I actually think it's important to be giving that feedback and even kind to them, because I've also been in a situation where I did not give feedback and then randomly fired someone. And while I had valid reasons when I was firing them, they felt blindsided because I didn't give them any indication beforehand of what wasn't going well. And so I wish that I had done a sort of PIP type structure in advance where I did give them feedback and gave them a chance to improve. But overall, a YC partner once told me during office hours that if you have an inkling that they're not going to work, it's probably not going to work, even if you are transparent with feedback. But I still think it's a nice thing to give them the courtesy of feedback earlier on. And in maybe 10% of cases, they actually do improve to your liking. So it really just depends, but that's something that I would keep in mind. Alrighty, and then the very last piece of YC advice was around fundraising. So they actually recommend that you don't start fundraising until maybe 2-ish weeks before demo day, but personally, the main YC advice that I disagree with is that I think you should actually be fundraising earlier, and by the time you do demo day, it should almost be kind of like just topping up your round and serving as sort of a last-ditch option in the case that your round dynamics didn't work out the way you wanted it to. I personally have seen a lot of top funds close their YC deals and their YC allocation prior to demo day. So I just think it's important to get ahead of that. And I raised in March, April-ish of 2022, and that was right before the economy crashed. So that ended up being really beneficial for me, and I am glad that I did that. My last piece of advice that I thought of as I was looking back at this footage is that you should continuously be tweeting your learnings during YC, because you can start to build out a social media presence, and the power of tech Twitter is deeply underestimated. You should consistently be building out a social presence and be building in public, because the benefits of that are long lasting and under discussed. So for instance, I was actually tweeting throughout my journey anything that I would learn, anything I found insightful, quotes that I heard during YC, and I would tag the speaker. It all ended up contributing in some way. I've had some of the speakers in YC DM me personally. We ended up getting coffee and meeting, and I just built general awareness around what I was building, and I kind of built out some credibility around TikTok marketing and building out a social media presence, and people at YC happy hours would recognize me, like other founders in my batch. So that was really helpful. So yeah, that's everything that you learn in YC, or what was personally insightful for me. There's definitely so many more lessons, as I mentioned, and all of the resources continue to compound in utility even after YC. So I definitely recommend doing YC regardless, but hopefully this was helpful, and comment below any feedback that you might have or additional advice. Thanks for watching.
I'm tryna put you in the worst mood, P1 greener than your church shoes, Millie point 2 just to hurt you, all red lamb just to tease you, none of these toys on lease to, made your whole year in a week too.